Abbas Amanat is Professor of History and International Studies at Yale University, where he's also Director of the program in Iranian Studies. I wish we had such a program here. He's an extremely prolific author whose publications include Resurrection and Renewal, The Making of the Babi Movement in Iran, 1989, Pivot of the Universe, Nasir-ad-Din Shah Qajar and the Iranian Monarchy, 1997, and Apocalyptic Islam and Iranian Shi'ism in 2009. He's also co-authored and co-edited numerous titles, including a special issue of the Journal of Iranian Studies on Iran's environmental changes and challenges in 2016. His forthcoming book, as if this wasn't enough, is entitled Persian at World, A Conceptual Inquiry. It will be published by Brill in 2018. Abbas Amanat will present for us today his most recent work titled Iran, A Modern History, published by Yale University Press in 2017. It looks at 5 centuries of national and transnational history and explores overarching themes that connect the history of the Safavid Empire and the emergence of the religion-state symbiosis with modes of modernity in the 19th and the 20th centuries, and the course of events that lead to the revolution of 1979 and its aftermath. I'm delighted to have Mr. Amanat here at Berkeley. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Dr. Goodrich, and for the chance to visit Berkeley after last time I was here was 25 years ago. It was a long time ago, and I was asked how it has changed. I thought I even can't remember how it was before. It was so long back. Although it's more built up, the only thing I can notice here. It's a beautiful campus, so I'm sure you're very proud of this place, and a lot of very interesting work that comes out of here. As a historian, we always look at our rivals, and Berkeley is, of course, it's always at the top of the list. That being said, the chance here to talk about the book, my recent book, Iran, A Modern History. Actually, what you see here as the title of the talk, In Search of Modern Iran, was the original title of the book before my publisher convinced me that I have to change it to just simply Modern History. And I did it reluctantly, and there was also a subtitle, but my editor told me again that subtitles these days are not very popular, particularly if you have a trade book. This was published as a trade book rather than as an academic book. So the subtitle may actually say something, or the potential subtitle, say something about what this book was about. It was called Authority, Memory, and Nationhood. So the idea was to try to see the relationship between these 3 components in the history of Iran over a long period of time, kind of a long durée coverage of the history of the past 500 years. Well, let me start as good old Persian literature tradition with a verse from Rumi that may sum up an aspect of my talk today, or as a matter of fact, it's kind of a disclaimer. First, I would read the Persian verse. گر بریزی بحر را در کوزه‌ای چند گنجد قسمت یک روزه‌ای. So, I suppose the translation is, if you pour the ocean in a jug, how much does it take but a daily ration? So, you can interpret this in many ways. One is that perhaps this book, despite its huge size, is perhaps a jug, perhaps a little bit oversized jug. But compared to the ocean, which is 500 years, and historians these days, I'm sure, very interested to go to details and write monographs. We all write monographs as historians. But sometimes we give ourselves a chance to move on and talk about big things, big themes in history. And therefore, we have an ocean in front of you, in a sense. And then, of course, he said, how much it takes, how much does it take, but a daily ration. And the daily ration may be also applied to the reader in kind of a sense that it may not be the kind of a book that you will be able to finish in one day. unless you have a kind of a biblical notion of the day. It's usually a year, but it could be 1,000 years. So, but, well, as I sometimes pointed out, it could be read, it's in 4 parts. And it's every season you can read one part of it. And that's how it was structured. It's basically, it just worked out that way. That it has a first part of it is the Safavid period from 1501 to the rise of the Bajar dynasty, or rather to the beginning of the 19th century. Part 2 is from the fall of the Bajar era, from 1800 to the end of the constitutional revolution around 1911 or thereabouts, at least the official date of constitutional revolution. And then the third part is the Pahlavi era, from around 1914 and all the way to the revolution of 1979. And the fourth part of the book is from 1979 really to 1989. That was my initial point of closure. But the course of events over this long period of time gradually gravitated me further toward 2009. And I really seriously tried to stop there. Although there are hints at the very end of the book in the epilogue about a kind of a forecast about what we'll see ahead of us. Although historians are not really fortune tellers, but they can at least tell you what are the trends. So that brings me actually to why this book in the first place. Part of the reason is that I have been teaching for many years a course on modern Iran, making of modern Iran, and I was always debating with myself when I'm going to start. Sometimes start with the constitutional revolution and then gradually move backwards, started with the early Bajar period, obviously because it's the period of my specialization, and then further back over the course of time to talk about the Safavid period. So there was an interest in writing a book of that nature. And then my publisher, Yale University Press, has already published a book on modern Iran. Some of you may be familiar, it was for many years a kind of a textbook by Professor Kelly, The Roots of Revolution. Still many courses on modern Middle East or modern Iran teach this book. And Yale University Press still reprints every now and then. It brings out a new edition called Modern Iran. So it's actually a source of confusion too, because there are 2 books called Modern Iran published by the same press. What can I do? So, I hope Professor Kelly is not going to be upset that there is a new book with the same title. So the Yale Press asked me to write a book basically answering the question, why after perhaps 3/4 of a century of secularization and movement towards the creation of a modern state, quote unquote, we have a revolution in 1979 that basically is a counter-narrative, or at least on the surface, to what the whole narrative of the Pahlavi period was about. What happens is an important question, and that was my point of departure. I wanted to answer that question. However, in the course of writing this book, more and more kind of long-term questions became important for me, or more challenging to try to answer, rather than just focusing on the causes of the 1979 revolution. And that's why the size of the book, which initially was supposed to be about 300, 350 pages, turned out to become eventually 900 something. And then that, I tried to answer a question about how Iran actually maintained its sovereignty over a long period of time, compared to many of the neighboring empires of the early modern times, both the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire of India, or subcontinent. Iran, although the Safavid Empire disappeared, but somehow there was a more a sense of a continuity, both in terms of the political culture, in terms of territorial boundaries of Iran, in terms of its cultural memory that survived for a longer period of time. And as a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, there was a conference. You can sit here if you like. That's too close. There was a conference at Cambridge 2-3 years ago, precisely on the subject of sovereignty at the age of high imperialism, or the age of empires. These days, people don't talk about imperialism, they talk about empires. So the purpose of it was to try to see how certain political entities survive in the age of colonialism, where virtually much of the world in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries were dominated or colonized by great European powers. And Iran is one of those exceptions, along with perhaps China, Japan, Ethiopia, Thailand, possibly you can include the Ottoman Empire if you come before the First World War. The end of the First World War is the end of the Ottoman Empire. And as a matter of fact, Iran could have been also in the same position. At the end of the First World War, there were every reasons for it to be dissected, fragmented into at least 2 entities, if not more, given the history of the famous Anglo-Russian agreement of 1907 and its consequences during the course of the war, and the vested interest of the 2 empires throughout the course of the war. So there are, I'm not claiming that I'm the only person who has ever tackled this very difficult question, but it's important to look at it in the longer term, that how the survival could be seen in a broader perspective of 500 years rather than purely in the course of First World War or a number of other critical moments in the history of this past 500 years. In the 18th century, there could have been also very, after the collapse of the Safavid Empire in 1722, much of Iran was actually occupied, both in its western borders by the Ottomans and in the eastern parts by the Uzbek and a variety of other Sunni powers, semi-nomadic or nomadic powers in its eastern frontiers. But nevertheless, it also had another kind of a savior figure who turned out to be a great disappointment as far as the Iranians were concerned. That was Nadir Shah. And in a sense, this process was repeated several times. So that fascinates me, this idea that the kind of nationalist sentiments aside, if you look really at a very close factual reasons for why a country like Iran has survived for quite a long period of time, it's amazing. If you look, for instance, at 14th century famous geographical work by Hamdullah Mustafi, is a well-known historian, geographer, himself a Mustafi. I'm sure some of you know Mustafi, and state accountants, so they know pretty well the geography because they're tax collectors. So he writes a history called Nazhatul Ulum. It's about the history of the Islamic world, I'm sorry, geography of the Islamic world. And he starts with Mecca, this is the sacred world, so it gives a chapter, defines the boundaries of the Jaziratul Arab, and then moves on to talk about Iran. Actually he uses the term Iran, which is why it said this is a 14th century text. So the notion of a geographical entity called Iran is there even before the Safari. Since the Iranians actually, the term was used very regularly. And you would see that the way that he defines Iran in terms of its boundaries pretty much corresponds to what you would see today on the map, with some perhaps frontier lands, some of the provinces, the Caucasus, which indeed was not in the 14th century part of the Iran proper. But more or less the boundaries, the way that he defines is what you find in the 21st century on the map. So that's fascinating. And many years ago, I was reading, during my graduate years, a fascinating autobiography by the famous historian Edward Gibbon, the 18th century writer, historian of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Is kind of a classical work of history for its own time. And it's quite remarkable what he says that about this whole process of how he becomes engaged with this issue of decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And he says for many years he was thinking about a kind of topic that would engage him and makes him interesting about it. And for some years he was thinking of actually writing a history of the Swiss Federation, which compared to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is a very kind of a limited topic. But he actually says why this was of interest to him. He points out that the question is this. This is Swiss with some 20-odd cantons and a very insurmountable terrain because of this high mountains all around it and the scattered communities all over. 3 languages, ethnicities, different ethnicities, different religion, particularly in the early modern times, religious conflicts between the rise of Protestantism, as some of you may know. Zurich was a major center for it, Geneva was a major center for that. All of this, it still manages to survive as a nation. So how come, when all the factors that corresponds to the classical theory of creation of a nation state is missing, still you have a nation called Switzerland? And he was actually seriously going to write about that in the 18th century. Then he says that once he travels to Rome, which in the 18th century gradually is becoming part of the kind of attraction with the antiquity in Europe, and he goes to the Roman Forum and sits on this, magnificent ruins of the time, which was not built up at the time in what you would see in today's Rome. And he looks at it and he kind of fascinated with this whole collapse of an empire. And the ruins of an empire actually inspires him to go back and try to answer why this great imperial power that ruled over a great part of the ancient world disappeared, declined and disappeared. And both these questions in a certain, and I'm not presumptuous to say that I'm thinking the same kind of a scale as Gibbon, but the questions both appeal to me. Because the first one, actually, the one of the Swiss Federation, in many respects applies to the case of Iran and many of the nations in the neighborhood. Afghanistan is another good example. The mountain ranges all around it, scattered communities, numerous dialects and languages all across the country, the great religious diversity, and great number of the ethnicities all across the Iranian world, and still managed to survive as a country. And then, of course, the question of decline and fall also appears a great deal, because it happened a number of times. Iran is among, as I said in the introduction of this book, was among very few countries that if you look at you have to deal with the rise and fall of at least 5 dynasties. You have to deal with 3 revolutions at least, if you include the rise of the Safavids, 4 revolutions. You have to deal with many civil wars that were fought. I cannot remember now the exact number. So, and it's a kind of a revival that happens periodically in the history of this land. And therefore, the second question, what the decline and fall in the Gibbon sense, is still somewhat has a resonance. And this also was an inspiration for me to try to think in this long term. One more thing is that some of you may be familiar with this rather mocking reference to work of the historians. It's usually attributed to another major historian of the early part of the 20th century, Arnold Toynbee, that nobody reads anymore. He has this massive 6-volume study of history, which was very popular in my younger age, and I read parts of it in Persian and the other parts of it in English during my undergraduate and actually high school years. And he has a famous saying, somewhat mockingly about his own work. He says, "What is history but one damned fact after another?" So this is almost the destiny of the historians, to write about one damned fact after another. No matter how you would try to fashion it, how you would try to write it, and of course, even in the age of postmodernism, when history is profoundly influenced by trends of theory, by interpretations that no longer follows that kind of a very strict Cartesian notion of history that we all were trained in my generation at least. Nevertheless, it still applies. So another challenge is, as I pointed out, challenges and rewards, is that how to put this fascinating and complex history with a certain narrative, along with a certain degree of analysis, and what kind of methodology you would apply or adopt in order to be able really to manage this complex history. Added to that was the fact that somewhat different to the predominant trend of historiography in our time. How many historians are here? Of course. Thank you. You may notice that, of course, you have written history that starts from pre-Islamic to modern, so it's a long-term history. So we are allies here. So, but the emphasis on the fact that you have to bypass the power of the state, which is one of the major trends of today's historiography, and try to look at course of events or development of trends beyond what the political history of any country would dictate. I have somewhat, to say, inevitably tried to apply as the structure of my work the political history and remain kind of loyal to it, as I just pointed out at the moment. So that's one thing that the 4 parts that I pointed out is basically the 4 eras or epochs in the history of the country, and ending with the Islamic Republic. But at the same time, I tried to break those barriers that were very familiar to us. I mean, we all, as part of our profession, tend to compartmentalize. You know, you write political history, you write socioeconomic history, you write environmental history, you write cultural history, and this is much more manageable than writing something that would incorporate all of this together. However, again, I rebelled a little bit against that. So, as some of you, I hope, be convinced to read this book eventually, and these parts of it, you would notice that there is a kind of a motivational factor in it. I've tried to put something of my own personal touch or interest in a history of this long period of time. In the introduction, somewhat again mockingly, I pointed out this is a history with attitude. So there is some kind of a personal side into it that led to the kind of a break of these frontiers that we recognize between political history, social history, economic history, and most significantly cultural history. So you would see that in trying to retell this narrative or its analysis of this narrative, I've used as much poetry as I use the history of political change or social change or economic change. There is a lot of translations of, particularly from the early 20th century, with politicization of poetry in the constitutional period and afterwards. Also reference to arts and architecture, music, cinema in later times, of course, popular culture. There are popular music, so all this tried to be incorporated, blended into political change. I have a whole chapter in the 1960s and 70s and how Iran at this time period basically incorporates 2 cultures of opposition and cultures of the state's patronage, and these 2 basically were incorporated into what created a kind of a background for this urge for a messianic almost revolution that was already in the minds of the poets and the musicians, filmmakers, and eventually materialized in ways that was totally unpredictable and surprising to them. So that's another side of it. I also try to use a lot of biographical details, because I also, as I pointed out in the preface of this book, again, referring to Rumi, he was pretty preoccupied also how to structure this famous work of his Masnavi, which is in 6 volumes, and how to tell his own story, basically. And he has a famous verse. He says, "The secret of the beloved is best to be told in the stories of the others." بهتر آن باشد که سر دلبران گفته آید در حدیث این و آن. And this kind of a return to a biography as a way to tell your story is also as part of the way that this history was written. How much more time do I have? Because I want to leave some time for questions.
Until 1. I mean, till 1:30, excuse me.
1:30,
1:30,
okay.
yeah.
I
And then
can
we
talk
have an hour
until
for
1:30.
Yes.
Sure. Okay, good. That's very reassuring. Well, I've also tried, for the sake of this talk, instead of actually starting from the point of departure, 1501, to try to go in reverse. And I've attempted that to try to see, it's experimental, to see how it works in a talk, to try to start from 1979 and go backward. Partly because it's more tangible to the audiences if you start from that point and go backward. If you look first of all in the revolution of 1979, it's not a surprise or a revelation, but basically it's at the tail end of a century that already witnessed a revolution and a half, I would call it. The constitutional revolution in 1906 to 1911, or the beginning of the First World War, 1914. The second important episode, that is the period between 1941 and 1953, the period of national movement, the struggle for oil nationalization under Mossadegh, that it's virtually had all the potentials of being a revolution, both ideologically in terms of the multitudes in the cities, all the aspects that would associate with the popular revolution, and of course the revolution of 1979. And it's inevitable that one tried to see whether there is a relationship between these three major upheavals in one century. By the way, Iran is also among the very few countries that had two major revolutions in one century, the 20th century. Perhaps China too, because if you take the revolution of the early constitutional revolution at the beginning of the 20th century and the 1948 communist revolution, and consider the second one as really a popular revolution rather than a takeover by an ideological party or ideological force, China probably is another example that draws the same kind of a comparison. But in the Iranian case, it's interesting to see what are the objectives of the constitutional revolution, or for that matter, the events, the national movement in the 1940s and 50s. One trend that becomes very obvious, of course, is the struggle for the creation of a liberal democratic regime in Iran. A more kind of pluralist political system with the rule of law, with constitution at its core, division of powers, equality before the law for all social classes and for all ethnicities and for all religious tendencies or religious denominations, and of course a sense of social justice, which is very much at the center of it, and very much corresponds to the old Shi'i idea of justice as part of the at least idealized interpretation of Shi'ism. Also, as far as this revolution of 1979, as far as the revolution of 1906 is concerned, the idea of secularization of Iran, moving away from a kind of a predominance of a religious institutions over the society, the influence of religious institutions over the society. So to sum it up, in both events there is a kind of a rebellion against the absolute power of the state, as it happened in the case of the constitutional revolution and in the case of the national movement against the Pahlavi regime. Pahlavi monarchy, and also this aspect that it's far less was received attention against the religious establishment. Constitutional revolution, one major aspect of it is actually try to reduce and weaken the power of the religious establishment. Of course, the standard narrative of the constitutional revolution always gives us one or two major mujtahids who are in the forefront of the constitutional movement. But as a matter of fact, if you look at the majority of the religious authorities in the early 20th century, they eventually became kind of opposition to the constitutionalists, moved far more in the direction of support for the monarchy. I'll come to that in a moment. But you know, when you look at these trends, something that, in my opinion, is prevalent in the course of these revolutions is the fact that there is a profound issue in the political culture of virtually all the systems that adopted the old, ancient model of Persian kingship. We should not forget about the fact that throughout the Islamic world, ever since probably 11th century, the kind of end of the caliphate, or effective caliphate, up to the 20th century, most models of kingship, which is known as the sultanate, is that old notion of Persian kingship that was adopted in the Islamic period, become a Perso-Islamic model of kingship. Ottomans had it, Mughal Empire had it in the early modern times, of course Seljuk empires and other empires of the earlier times also adopted the same system. Iran has also remained very loyal since the Safavid period. One aspect of it is that there is a tension within this culture, within this political culture or political institution, between the power of the rulers or the kings, the shahs in the Iranian case, or the sultans in the kind of a more Islamic context, and the ministers, that's usually being referred to as wazirs, and more generally speaking, if you want to talk about the institution of divan, that is the entire administration of the state, or the executive power of the state, or the executive agency of the state. Between the ministers and the rulers, there is this constant kind of a symbiosis, and yet at the same time a degree of tension. Since the authority of the rulers were often viewed as a kind of a charismatic rule of the shahs, with a kind of a divine mandate. If you look at the Iranian example, the mandate of the shahs is not granted by the priests, or by the, as it is in the case, as I argued in the introduction of the book. The idea of the Shah in the Iranian context is a very unique one. It's not like the Rex in European languages, or Raj in Sanskrit, but in ancient Persian, Shah is the concept of a ruler who is basically self-legitimizing. And this self-legitimization comes directly from a divine source. It does not come through a church to legitimize the ruler. And this gives them a degree of authority that is often in tension with the authority of the ministers, who often are in charge of the state. And the tension between the two is visible throughout the period. I've gone to some length to try to explain that in the book. You will find, for instance, there are a very good example of it actually is the period of the national movement, the tension between Mossadegh as the prime minister and the Shah as this kind of authority of the court is one very good example of this tension that ultimately resulted, as it often happened, in the downfall of the ministerial power. Or another example in the 19th century, which is so much in the Iranian collective memory, is that the example of Amir Kabir and Nasiruddin Shah. So Amir Kabir is a representative of this branch of the state which is responsible for the Divan, and then you have the ruler Nasiruddin Shah that claims some kind of a legitimacy on its own and on his own. So that's a continuing theme that I try to follow throughout the book. But perhaps equally important, and again related to this history of the revolutions in the 20th century, is the fact that the religious establishment has a very complex interaction with the political power. Contrary to some historians of the elder generation, including some people in this university, you would see that the religious establishment has often been portrayed as a force of opposition to the state, as a kind of a supporter of the masses versus the state. Whereas in reality, if you actually look at much of what historical facts tell us, is that these were two powers that supported each other throughout very long. Again, as part of this theory of government in the Perso-Islamic context, they were often seen as the twin sisters that support each other. And if one does not support the other, it would result in a crisis and eventually collapse. That's part of the political theory of government, going back maybe to the 6th century, the late antiquity, the Sasanian Empire. And it's continued. Much of the literature of counsels to the kings, the Siratul Muluk or Andaz literature, you would find the same phenomenon. That it's often the advice to the kings is that they have to make sure that they have support of the religious establishment in order to maintain the stability of the state. Why this was so crucial was the fact, as Nizam al-Mulk points out in his famous book of government, Siyasatname, that there is such a thing called the bad religion. And this bad religion often is a messianic revolutionary religion which is against the power of the priest or the political or the religious establishment. And periodically threatens the authority of the religious establishment. So you need the state in order to support the religious establishment to withstand the power of the revolutionary movements, mostly messianic, Mahdistic movement in a sense. So that's another side, interesting side of this collaboration. Indeed, there is a Bavarian term for it. He conceptualizes the authority of the state into three components: is the kings, the priests, and the prophets. And the prophets basically often challenge first the priests, but eventually the kings. Or sometimes they come to terms with the kings against the priests. And all these models you can see in the Iranian context. So it's remarkable to see that this tendency in both directions, if you look at the Constitutional Revolution, if you go backward, you see this collaboration between the establishment, religious establishment and the state is very strong. Actually, it's the very foundation of the Safavid state. The Safavid state, once established, declared Shiism as a state religion, actually invented a new religious establishment by actually inviting a group of jurists that were not Iranians. Majority of them were from southern Lebanon, from Syria, from Bahrain, from southern Iraq, from Najaf, from provinces of Qatif in what is today the Arabian, Saudi Arabia, the Eastern Province, which is a substantial Shia community. These were those that were brought into the Safavid Empire in the 15th century, patronized by the state, supported by the state. They created a judicial establishment. And that was part and parcel of the state support for maintenance of this high clerics that referred to as mujtahids, or the jurists, fuqaha, taqi, throughout the period. And with some kind of a semblance of monopoly over the institutions of, judicial institutions of the state. They were in charge of the courts, they were in charge of the religious establishment in the provinces. The Sheikh al-Islams everywhere was appointed by the government and were sent over. Oh, it took them about a century or century and a half before they become all Persianized. But nevertheless, they maintained their own identity somewhat clear from, independent from the state, but very dependent on it as well. This is kind of a semi-autonomous position. That in the Qajar period, in the 19th century, further reinforced. So you would find the jurist establishment of the 19th century much more, in effect, distinct from the state. Still very much in symbiosis with the state, in collaboration with the state, but somewhat different from the authority of the rulers. Qajars as the rulers and the Mujtahids as the religious establishment were both present and still in charge of the judicial and other functions, educational and so forth in the Qajar society. What happened in the Constitutional Revolution and afterwards is that it's probably one of the most significant changes that Iran witnessed is in the Pahlavi era, as the state further implemented a top-down series of reforms and with more or less independent sources of income that came out of the extracted economy of oil, allowed the state to basically marginalize the power of or the influence of the religious establishment in the 1920s, 30s, perhaps again in the 1960s, 50s and 60s. The outcome of it was that the religious establishment gradually was actually lost much of its functions in the society, lost much of its power or influence because many of its functions were actually incorporated to the institution of the secular modern state, of which the most important was the judiciary. There's a difference here between the Ottoman case and the Iranian case, for instance, or the Egyptian case and the Iranian case. Whereas in the Egyptian case and the Ottoman case, the appointment of